Hello everybody, welcome back to the Overlap Breakdown YouTube channel. I'm joined as always by my co-host Umir, who's a professional football scout and analyst, and more importantly, a Manchester City fan. And today we're going to cover everything based on Manchester City and Pep Guardiola and try and touch on why they've been struggling so much this season. So to kick right off, this was the first time that Pep Guardiola has lost 4 games on the bounce in his managerial career. He did lose 4 on the bounce at Bayern Munich in 2015, but apparently penalty losses don't count.
No, it's a draw officially.
It's a draw officially, but yeah, he has done it before, so even though it is a bit of a shell-shocking kind of stat, it has happened. And he has been there and done it before, so there's nothing to worry about. Yeah, we want to touch on what's going wrong with Manchester City this season. And before we get into the tactics and the board and stuff, we want to read off a little bit of the top line stats. In the 24-25 season, this season, Manchester City have got the 4th oldest squad on average in comparison to the rest of the Premier League. The last time Manchester City had a squad as old as this was, in fact, in Pep Guardiola's first season, where they also had the 4th oldest squad. Their average age this season is 26.9. When he took over in the first year, the average age was 28.1, which is pretty crazy.
People go about,
I know, that's a transform.
We needed to.
That's a transformation, that, from Pep Guardiola. But yeah, they've never had a squad in comparison to the rest of the Premier League as old as this one. So even though the numbers might be higher, the intensity that the Premier League is now does require a bit more of a youthful squad. This is one thing that we spoke about earlier in the season. Do you think Manchester City have freshened the squad up enough? Because for me, City always had a really good knack of doing this thing where they'd have a player just coming out and then boom, they'll put one in. And it takes a season for him to get in. Like the Rodri and Fernandinho situation, 1 season, and now he's a starter. Done it with the keepers, done it with fullbacks, centre-backs. Do you think this season, did you only sign Savio, Gundogan, yeah. Do you think that was enough to go again?
I don't know. I think in retrospect, it's easy to say.
It looks like it's not.
We needed a million other players. I think the Rodri situation is very key to touch on. With Guardiola, how he set up his teams in the past, he's always wanted a small squad. I think that's part of Guardiola's request. Even if there were more players on the market, I think he wants a small squad, a squad of maybe 16 players, 17 players, a very tight-knit group who rotate, who all are fresh, who are all in form and ready to play when they are called upon. With the injuries, I think it really highlights just how short we are in general. And in the past, we've had a really strong academy cohort to call on. We're kind of lacking that at the moment. We've obviously got Simpson Pusey coming in at centre-back in the last game. But
Rico
as well. But I would class him as a senior player. I think in previous seasons we've had the likes of Cole Palmer, Phil Foden, when they were first coming through, able to put in minutes, especially in those midfield attacking areas that we're not seeing at the moment. But in general, I think how City tend to build with that squad of 16 and 17 players is by having players who can do multiple roles, play multiple positions. Because in a way, then you've got cover in sort of one position with 3 different players. That same player can cover in sort of midfield or on the wing or in number 9. We've seen it with Phil Foden numerous occasions. Whatever the team needs, he seems to just have to sort of adapt and mould his game into either right wing or false 9 or left wing or in midfield this season. So that's tended to be how Manchester City and Guardiola build their squads. I think that tends to work, but with the number 6 and the number 9, they're very specialist positions.
Yeah.
When those players are out, when Rodri's out, if Haaland were to go out,
it's hard to be versatile.
Yeah, it's hard to. I think Phil Foden could probably bridge that gap in false 9, but do you have the profiles of midfield to supplement that? Yeah. The number 6 is very noticeable.
Specialist role, isn't it?
I would say Gundogan. I've seen him in the past, sort of in the season prior to his move to Barcelona, do that number 6 role really well. Kovacic, for what he's offering in possession, has been brilliant, and Gundogan for the ability to contribute to, and I think we'll touch on the stats in a little bit, the XG and some of the play going forward. He's needed because we lack goals in general, but I've seen Gundogan do that number 6 role. So I thought in the summer, having him in those positions would have been okay if Rodri needed rest. But now you've got an entire season with Kovacic and Rodri, and it looks a little bit maybe a player short. But I think the injuries have certainly exacerbated all of that. Yeah,
so Manchester City's injury list, for those who don't know, I think it's very easy to kind of brush over these
Yeah,
sort of
people
things.
kind of say, look, they've got a lot of money and all these players, but it's a small squad.
But it's a small squad, and they've got Rodri, De Bruyne's just come back, Ruben Diaz, Jack Grealish, Jeremy Doku, John Stones, and Oscar Bob, who are all out.
Yeah.
And when you actually look at it, you're missing 3 wingers, and Oscar Bob was going to be a key figure in this side.
Yeah.
You could tell from the Community Shield and so on and so on. Jack Grealish and Jeremy Doku being out, huge.
I mean, we've got Núñez now playing as our first choice left winger, so...
You conceded first in 5 matches before you went on the losing streak.
Yeah.
You conceded first in like 5 of the first 8 or 9 matches.
Yeah.
And you went on to win them games. Something that's really interesting in the past 2 games that you've lost is that you've played outstanding in the first 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Put the team under ridiculous amounts of pressure. Could have scored 1, could have scored 2.
Yeah.
Took the lead early, both against Brighton and Sporting.
Yeah.
And in the second half,
it's a good point.
And it's a reverse. It's a reverse of what you were doing, which is starting slow, but now you're finishing slow.
Yeah,
is there anything you can say about? I know it's a bit of a weird.
I think.
Is it simply because? I don't know.
There was a Bernardo Silva quote recently, where he goes, "In the last 3 games, it feels like things are just not going our way. We're putting up good chances in the opponent's box, we're not scoring. We're conceding small chances, and sometimes those chances are going in. So whether or not I think in football sometimes there's this sort of mentality aspect to it. There's almost self-fulfilling thing where if teams feel like they can get at City given recent performances, and I think as players tire themselves, knowing that they've not scored the chances up front, some of those nerves get reintroduced into the game. I think sometimes I feel, and this is a little bit of a sidetrack point, but I feel like if a team has a penalty, if my team has a penalty and we miss, we're more likely to concede in the next 5-10 minutes.
That's how football works.
Yeah.
I think to be fair, one of the things you could say about it is, it sounds stupid because I'm always coming back to this point, but the squad is older.
Yeah.
And obviously if you're tiring and it sounds stupid, but to hold the ball for 70% of the game and be so mentally aware, and you have to be locked into every moment of that game. You cannot mess up on the ball once, otherwise one dispossession at the back and you're gone. But against Brighton, one of the players that I thought was particularly poor was Kyle Walker. I thought he was really bad on the second goal. The switch from play, not really communicating with JSP at the back. Just, it seems what we talked about prior to this, but the back line, it's not fluid, it's not got the chemistry, it's not got the synergy, they've not played together that much, so it seems like the communication's off. And I think it's probably just a matter of everything all at once, crumbling City. Yeah. But one thing I wanted to touch on, and this is where we'll actually get into the counters and the board, and you might as well stick every counter over here, because that's what we're going to talk about. So moving on to Manchester City and why they've potentially been conceding goals, losing games. Expected goals per shot, Manchester City have conceded the most in the Premier League, and goals per shot on average 0.13. This is the second most in the Premier League this season, behind only Wolves, who obviously are not really having, probably not having a great season. So I want to talk about how we've touched on the injuries, the lack of physical flooring. Yeah. Do you think that when City get in their attacking shape, which we'll set up in a minute, do you think that there are structurally things going wrong? Yeah, and I think whenever I talk about, or whenever I analyse the team, I always look back to personnel informing what the structure means. So I'll move into the shape that we played in going forward this season. We tended to build in a 3 at the back. Normally, it's just sort of 1 in here. But at times you get this sort of box. Once we've got a sort of settled possession, it does move into a 3-1. I'd say 6 for lack of a better term. You got Erling Haaland up top, usually Savinho on that right this season. At the moment, it's Núñez here. We've got Phil Foden as one of those box players. Rico's often picked up positions in this half space. You've got Ilkay Gundogan and Kovacic usually, but obviously Bernardo Silva's picked up positions in this midfield, sometimes on the wing. And then you get your 3 central defenders like that. Now, as we continue to see City grow into games and try and pen teams in, they try to overload the back line, put another player in, and then often this sort of player is usually Bernardo Silva or Rico Lewis. Just roaming in there. Yeah, just trying to pin, by moving in these very central areas, trying to pin players to open up these spaces in.
the half space, and then you've got Kovacic normally in here who kind of dictates the play. And I think in general, you've got a team here that retain the ball really well. I think you'll probably have some stats to reel off in the sense that they keep the ball really well.
Yep.
They pen teams in, and they've got 1 million touches.
Yes.
That's not the specific term.
Well, he's right. He's very right.
Yeah.
City have almost got 1,000 more touches in the attacking third than any other team in the Premier League.
Yeah.
I think Spurs are second with 800 less touches in the attacking forward. So attacking third, sorry. So it's obvious that Manchester City are they're just continuing on from being this relentless possession-holding team who pin you in.
Yes.
And as long as they're on the edge of the box, they can score goals, and everyone knows that. And I'm going to touch on, I think you were about to mention what I'm going to say now.
Go on.
So we did some data research just before this because we had a key point we wanted to touch on. This season, expected goals for Manchester City for individual players. Haaland's got the most with 11 expected goals, and the second most in totality is Savinho, joint with Ilkay Gundogan on 1.7.
Yeah.
Now, Guardiola has been probably your second biggest goal threat this season in terms of actual goals and scoring, which is ridiculous. But Erling Haaland's obviously getting the ball filtered into him, and when he's scoring, it's great. He scored against Brighton. Yeah. I think it's the only game that Erling Haaland has scored in which he's lost for Manchester City in his career.
Wow.
I think that's right. I'll have to double check, but I think that's right. But what's happening is when City are pinning teams in, we always mention that when teams set up with this, the 3-1-6 or the 3-2-5, what the opposition team is always looking to do against Manchester City, you can find this in virtually any game you play, is this space here is never open for City. You have to get rid of the midfield, and you have to put as many bodies in there. Doesn't matter if the striker's in the midfield. It has to be 4. 3 maybe, but 4 for proper solidity.
Yeah. And City are always trying to either bring onto them or push them deeper to get that space in that area.
Yeah.
But I think if we frame a lot of this video and a lot of Manchester City's analysis by thinking about how they look to shift around those players, I think it's really enlightening.
So the reason why City have moved, as Umir said before, the reason why City have gone to much more of a 3-1-6 is because they believe that with how teams have gone even more defensive against Manchester City, they think that having 6 players here is a lot more effective in terms of pinning, overloading the centre, getting more bodies between the lines. And obviously, if a team's defending with more bodies in the back, you don't need as many bodies in your rest defence.
And it also opens up you've got sort of really technical, small pocket players in Rico, in Phil Foden, and then Ilkay Gundogan here for some goal threat.
Yeah.
Bernardo Silva as well in these areas. So they have the proficiency in those areas. They have the intelligence to pin players here. Reduced attacking threat on the other side, like you mentioned, but I just want to add also it isolates your wingers who tend to be good 1v1 to drive at their opposition fullback and then pull it back for Kovacic, who's seen a fair number of goals this season himself.
We're just going to move on into how City are playing out of possession. I think against Brighton, it was something that was picked up on quite a lot because City, as we know, have a really high line. Their keeper's had the most sweeps. He's got the highest average distance off his goal line out of anyone. It's always the same for Manchester City. It's very, very aggressive. On average, the distance per shot is the closest to Manchester City's goal out of any team in the Premier League in 15 yards. It's joint with Spurs, which is interesting because they're both facing similar problems. I want to touch on out of possession for Manchester City because against Brighton, it was something that I thought was a really big problem. So let's just say for a matter of fact that this is Brighton. What Brighton were doing was City don't really have many moments when they're off the ball in a mid-block. Against lesser teams, Brighton are a bit more of a ball-playing team. They like to have more of the ball, they take risks out the back. In the first half, Manchester City were actually pinning them quite well. We're winning the ball high, turning over the ball.
And I think, that was partly because obviously with that extra player here, and we'll move this guy here, with that extra player there, these 2 players had the responsibility covering those passes into there, and there was a lack of a man in that line. So obviously you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These players weren't always as high as they are in this occasion. You tended to have sort of 3 against 4 in the back line. in sort of Brighton versus Manchester City there, and then these two players could cover those central areas. In the second half, you moved a player up here, and then suddenly you had 4 against 4, and Mitoma was probably the extra man. Sometimes there was a 6 against 4 or 5 if the wingers didn't track back. So there was a little tweak in how Brighton did move their pivot from a double pivot to a single pivot that caused City some issues in tracking the back line and some of those half-space runners.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was going to touch on. So João Pedro played a really, really crucial role in both the goals.
Yeah.
And what I found quite interesting was, as you just mentioned before, Mitoma was definitely the left winger.
Yeah.
And João Pedro was playing kind of in between. He was playing here. But what he was doing a lot was doing these sort of blindside runs. So when Kyle Walker was defending 1v1 with Mitoma, he was running across Kyle Walker's face and he was unsure whether or not to pick him up. But when he'd follow him in, it meant that Mitoma was the spare man.
Was it an underlapping run or
yeah, just off like across the face, like so he was like curving. He was curving around this side.
Okay.
And that meant that when he was drifting in there, obviously there's a second 9 in there, so he's his man. And Kyle Walker didn't really know to stay or go with another runner who was running around the penalty area. And we've seen this for the second goal, where I think it was Van Heck got on the ball.
Yeah, brilliant performance by him. Yeah.
He's really good on the ball, really strong player. And he played this long diagonal across the pitch, and he was around these spaces here, and he played this long diagonal over to Kyle Walker, and he ran inside with João Pedro initially, and then he realised that Mitoma was on his back, and the communication between Kyle Walker and JSP just weren't there. JSP had his man, but Kyle Walker could not see what he was trying to do.
Yeah.
So he didn't know whether or not to stay or go. He then ended up coming out, facing Mitoma 1v1, but because of the separation he'd already caused by going inside, Mitoma had the time to run into the box, cross it in, goal. Yeah. And I think just the communication with the back line, not really having a Ruben Diaz, who's obviously a vocal leader, box defender, captain.
Yes.
Not having that is a big worry.
And also, I think there's a point to be made about the lack of pressure on that first line.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to talk about, because in a lot of the game against Brighton, City were incredibly high up the pitch, but there was actually no pressure on the ball.
Yeah.
So City were almost defending like high up here.
Yeah.
But the back line was really, really high. Brighton were on the ball, and Manchester City were passive in the front line. So the back line was asking the forward line to press, asking them to step up.
And a lot of players making this sort of run. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want you to maybe touch on. I consider Phil Foden a pretty good player out of possession. I think he's a good presser. But in these sort of situations against Brighton, why is there no pressure? Why is there? What do you think? Is there an instruction? Is it personnel? Are they tired?
Yeah, I think. I mean, only the people within the team in the camp will know. I think all we can do is make assumptions and kind of give theories to why that might be the case. I think if I'm trying to rattle off a few from the top of my head, first thing I might mention is the fact that initially this was a double pivot for Brighton, and the plan seemed to be stop central progress here and prevent them from playing through the middle. I think that's partly informed by the fact that we're weak here in these central midfield areas. We're certainly weak there. Maybe Guardiola is just trying this as a scheme against Brighton to protect some of those middle areas, because what we've seen teams do is play quite through the centre, not against Brighton, probably in the game prior, and in doing so, you get those really big chances, 1v1 through the middle. We saw it against Fulham on numerous occasions. So perhaps they want to block the passes centrally, force teams out wide a little bit, and then have them trapped on those sides before they do defend. Now, obviously, even if that's the case, you don't want this man free to play a pass into these areas. If in situations where, let's say this plays a little bit deeper, and you've got enough players in these areas, even if this is the case, the ball gets played over here, you can double up, or you're focused on covering your man.
Yeah.
So the fact that Brighton had runners into these half spaces meant that players were often pinned. They didn't know who to track, and it was a brave approach from Brighton, but it meant that Manchester City were outnumbered, and as a result, that pass was on, that opportunity was on.
out of possession against Brighton, it was a high line, too much space in behind.
Yeah.
They had possession versus mid-block. Against Sporting, it wasn't that let you down.
No.
In terms of the mid-block being too high and the no pressure coming on the back three.
Yeah.
It was a different problem, which I think has been the more prominent problem. Which is the defensive transition. Now, obviously, this isn't something
which is
that's
why, by the way,
brand new.
I think this is why what we saw against Brighton was maybe trying to mitigate.
Maybe try to block instead of
cover
press.
the centre. Yeah.
So, obviously, Manchester City don't have many weaknesses, but the one massive weakness that's been there and it's been exploited, and you can't prevent it, whether you like it or not, is transitions.
Unless you've got Rodri.
Unless you've got Rodri. But no, you can't prevent this. It's been there. If someone holds the ball more than you and they're high up against the pitch against you,
that's where
you've got a whole half to aim at, and that is always going to be a case. So asking Manchester City to change this is virtually impossible because it's always going to be there. Now, against Sporting in the first half, you were really good, really brave, pinned teams in.
About better halves this season.
Definitely, I thought I was watching it in kind of Ruben Amorim goggles on, and I was like, this looks a lot like the games at the Etihad kind of thing. But on the board, we've got set up a situation in the game against Sporting are the red team, City are the blue team in this segment, and I want to touch on when the opposition team has the ball and they've now drawn the press onto them. So City are very aggressive in a 4-4-2, and Sporting are in their build-up structure. I know it's a back four, but on the ball in the keeper, they do go to a 4. You can check that out in the Ruben Amorim preview. And I want you to talk about how Manchester City's man-to-man pressure without the right physical quality in the back line or in the centre can maybe cause them more problems than what we've seen in past recent years.
Yeah, I think what we've seen from Manchester City this season, it's not massively different from what we've seen in the past, is typically on these centre-backs, it will be the front two that do apply the pressure. If they're playing a little bit deeper, what we often see is if the ball from the keeper goes out to one of the players, one of the strikers curves their run, blocks that half of the pitch, and then you try to go man for man in these situations and essentially try and win the ball high. What it does often leaves you man-to-man at the back as well. At times, what teams have done is they move a few players to leave one player free, just to give you a +1 in here. So the far side winger might come inside, you might leave one player back here to cover this area and give a little bit of support in there, but oftentimes they are trying to cover sort of large distances, and I think more than anything it's the personnel that are tasked with doing these difficult jobs. So if you've got this curved run from your striker, you're cutting off the pitch, but we've seen at times teams with very intricate, clever schemes in these situations play out from that initial pressure. If that's not the case, sometimes as games do progress with the factor of age, with the less intense pressure from Erling Haaland at times, there might just be a bit of a lack of intensity that does allow teams to get out initially.
Who's missing in the attacking lines to apply the forward pressure from the two strikers? So say it's Phil Foden and Erling Haaland.
Yeah.
How would you say? Would you say the forward pressure isn't breaking down? The forward pressure is fine, and it's just the midfield backing that up, or do you think there's been a change in the forward pressure personnel-wise that's struggling? I
think the forward pressure is not as good as it has been in past seasons.
Yeah.
I think some of Manchester City's best years have come when you've had players like Sterling, maybe here, Bernardo Silva here, a young Bernardo Silva in particular, making those very intense pressures on the opposition line, and Gabriel Jesus, another one, for example. I think in general, one, teams are getting better at playing out in those situations, and two, even if you do apply really good pressure, there's the ability to go long, and you've lost aerial quality in the midfield.
That's a good point.
And you're going 1-to-1 in the back line. In the Sporting game, for example, you got Gyökeres against JSP, who, I mean, it's a mismatch. He had a good game. Akanji probably carrying a knock because he's been out since, but a same sort of mismatch in there. But in terms of the pressure itself, personnel slightly related. Kevin De Bruyne, a young Kevin De Bruyne was brilliant, and he normally became the two here. I think Phil Foden is generally good in those areas. The wide pressure, I think we could be better in. I think Savinho is brilliant at it. Nunes is good at it as well. Grealish at times knows when to press, which is a very important point to make. But yeah, lacking a little bit of intensity in general. But personnel-wise, these do press, and then the ball goes out. If the ball is focused in the wide areas, these two players in the middle are tasked with covering a lot.
Would you say they're just running off the back of the midfielders? Do you think they're just getting away from it a lot easier than they used to?
We've seen previous examples where players sort of running here. If Gundogan, for example, has to follow, he can get spun in a few times, and then they can be out.
Can break,
at him. You've also just got sort of Kovacic normally as this one player here. As much as this is an issue and teams can build up and get through City, I think the main issue is once teams are a little bit further in their build-up, how these players, if they do move across,
that's a big thing.
Opens up.
That's a big thing because I've noticed a lot of central space, and what you've mentioned too there, I've just seen, this is just like something I've seen so much from City that I've never really seen before. It's just guys just being between the lines, just roaming off the ball. Like if the ball goes into the channels and it's Victor Gyökeres and he spins and he's 1v1, when I'm looking at the City defenders and they've got back, it's always this right here.
But you know
just
what?
Two guys just roaming behind and just ahead of the midfielders though.
That's happened if the ball goes to one side, one of the wide midfielders goes across, and by the time it takes this midfielder to come across,
they've already gone.
The space is in there to exploit. It's the same when you move it here and move it here. That space, I wonder whether or not sort of a 4-1-4-1 or three midfielders in there, a sort of 4-3-3 shape. I don't think we've seen it from Guardiola off the ball in its pressure. But maybe
getting three in there instead of two, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, possibly. Just to, if this guy goes wide, there's less distance for this guy to cover, and obviously you're leaving a player out there. But I wonder whether or not that could be a possible solution.
What would you, apart from the out of possession stuff, would you say it's just personnel, or are you worried? Do you think it's going to change? Do you think it's going to get worse? You've got Tottenham at home in the games after the international break.
Yeah.
Do you see it continuing?
I think this season Fulham was our worst performance and we won that game. I think in some of the games that we've played and lost, we've had good performances, at least in part. I think the Sporting first half, really good. I think the Brighton first half, really good as well. So in those situations, I think there is something there to be said that, look, Manchester City are not in a crisis. There's still good things, particularly in possession, in attack. We need more quality in the goals. We're lacking players who can pop up in those areas, who can get shots away, who can score those goals. I think I'd like to see a little bit more from İlkay Gundogan popping up in those areas. I think the wingers, once they come back from injury, can facilitate some of that chance creation. Savinho, he needs to be getting more chances to score. He's brilliant in his 1v1 quality, but we need players to pop up more in those situations. I think the out of possession stuff is sort of, you can make those tweaks that I've mentioned, but it is very heavily personnel related. Can you get your centre-back stepping into midfield in Akanji or Stones like we've seen in the past? Can Nunes play in the midfield? I'm not 100% convinced. In attacking possession, with the amount of times we have the ball in the opposition third, I think goals are naturally going to come. But obviously Kevin De Bruyne in the team elevates that. Obviously Doku coming back, Grealish coming back. I think that is very heavily personnel related, to be honest. And I think it's just a matter of timing. Once we get the international break in, once we get a little bit more of a cohesion with the new players back in, I think we will see a lot better attacking execution from Manchester City in that final third.
Yeah, right. That's going to be it for today's episode. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe if you want to see more tactical analysis and podcast exclusives. And we'll be back again next week to cover the Premier League's action. We'll see you next week.